Hello everybody and welcome to the very first Meet Maastricht podcast. It is the 24th of March 2020. I'm Katrina and I am here with
Lucy, also of Meet Maastricht. Quite curious about how we're going to manage this, Katrina. You in your house and I in mine.
Yes, we are very safely social distancing everyone, so there is no concern there. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you got involved in Meet Maastricht and Meet Maastricht, Lucy?
Well, the way I got involved was simply being in conversations with the founder of this magnificent institution, Justina Kaminska. And of course, she gave it the absolutely perfect name because the object of what we have done is exactly that, to meet the city and meet the people of Maastricht and also meet each other. That is how I became involved and that is how I stay involved. I was born and raised in Maastricht. I have lived here most of my life and pretty much since I was a teenager I have been walking around this city showing it to people, telling the stories and taking them to the more secluded places and just generally helping people see their environment. How about you?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm probably one of the English speakers who was really struggling to become involved in the cultural sector and just the culture of the city. I moved to Maastricht from Australia. You can probably tell from my accent. In early 2019, just having finished my master's in museum and heritage studies, so I was very keen to be involved in the cultural sector here and to learn more about my new home and my new city.
Good.
This podcast is a good chance to share it with some other people who might be stuck at home at the moment or wherever you are. Some of the places that we don't normally get to talk about and can't go inside for various reasons. So what is our first adventure, Lucy?
Well, to sort of ease us into the vast discrepancy between what we normally do and what we will be doing on the podcast, I chose a place that is accessible to the public but extremely well hidden. Of course, during our regular events, we can wander about the city and visit all kinds of large public institutions. That is no problem at all. But apart from that, the city does have this multitude of private spaces which are not accessible to the public, which do not offer regular tours or anything of the sort, and there's still heaps of stories out there worth talking about. And I thought, well, since we're all sort of locked into our own homes, we'll talk about these locked places elsewhere in the city and get some enjoyment out of that. But as I said, the first one to visit is accessible. You just have to know where to look. And it is in Dutch, Cellebroederskapel. So the chapel of the Cell brothers. And it is behind the houses on the Brussels Street. And if you don't know where it is, you will not see it.
No. Well hidden.
Yes, yes. But it is, as I said, it is quite accessible. It is being used for concerts, and the city has appointed it an official wedding venue. So there's civil weddings taking place there, but still in a beautiful little chapel, which even people who are no longer staunch Catholics generally don't object to. There's a lovely garden all around, and well, the people who are taking care of the chapel now are quite interested in offering it as a venue for all kinds of events which are suited to that environment. So no rowdy drinking bouts, I suppose, but I envisage things like elegant garden parties with straw hats and linen suits and dresses and stuff like that.
Yes.
Picnic on the grass. And anyway, this of course is also brought on by us not being able to do that now. And you get these visions of picnics.
Yes, indeed. Hopefully we'll be able to bring some lovely, lovely events to everyone in the summer when we are all set free again. We'll be able to crack out our straw hats then. But can you tell us a little bit about the beginnings of the Cellar Brothers?
Yeah,
Cell
Cell
Brothers?
Yes. Because they had tiny little rooms, as in cells.
Ah,
Yeah.
there we go.
It is interesting. Of course, I would say so. Don't take my word for that. But yeah, the beginnings are medieval, in a time when everything we now consider responsibilities of governments, regular social services, things like education and healthcare, were all provided by religious orders. And they would each have their specialty in this. In this larger context of monks and nuns providing these services to the public, the Cell Brothers are still a pretty particular brand of this, general service. They are the result of a pious movement of simple folk, not meant in any derogatory way, in what is now Belgium. Of course, these nation states are all 19th century mostly. So just think of the general region containing cities like Antwerp and Leuven and Bruges and Brussels, but also Liège or Luik, very close to Maastricht, as you are well aware. So this brand of piety moved people, both men and women, to live in communities, and the male communities would be called the Begaarde. And we still have a Boergaarden street in Maastricht, so that may have been a convent of this type of religiously inspired men. And the women's variety would be called the Begijnen. And this should remind you right away of the legendary Begijnhoven in the great Flemish medieval towns. In further north, this doesn't really occur. So it is definitely something of the southern Low Countries.
Oh.
So these people would form communities, but not actual monastic orders, because the requirements for that were pretty steep. You had to take these oaths of purity, meaning chastity, of course, and poverty and obedience. And these communities would simply come together, find a place to live together, pray a lot, and provide services to the community. And usually that would be healthcare. And quite often that would be the hardest kind of healthcare as well. They would be taking care of the victims of contagious diseases and of the people we would now consider mentally ill. And they would do house calls and visits, but they would also take people in and care for them in their convent. So in Maastricht there was a group of men doing this in the 14th century already, so more than 500 years ago.
Yeah. And is that when the chapel was built?
No, the chapel is slightly younger.
Okay.
It is during the last restoration, with the research that is now possible, the analysis of wood being used in the buildings.
Yeah.
I am not even going to try and pronounce that in English, but anyway, there is a way of dating wood, and so we have a pretty educated guess now that the chapel was built in 1512. So
wow, that is extremely precise.
Yes. Yeah, but they can do that. This wood dating,
amazing.
This wood dating method can tell you the year in which the tree was cut. That is then being used in the building in the construction, And this goes on the assumption that when it's oak, the wood was probably used after about a year after the tree had been cut down, because oak becomes so hard that if you let it lie around longer, it becomes so hard that it is too difficult to use it in construction. So they could establish the tree was cut in 1511. That dates the building to 1512.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's the monks were there before the chapel then.
Yes, and for quite a few decades. Yes. Yeah, and they were not monks, because they live in a monastic order, and these guys didn't. At least not at first.
Okay.
Not at first. It was more loosely organized. They were still put under the authority of the church. So the Sauvage monks, but also the local pastor would keep an eye on them, and could essentially order them to do or leave things as well. And they were under the authority of the civil lords of the city as well. And they paid them for their services. So that was their, providing these services also kept them with a roof over their heads and food on the table. Pretty sensible arrangement.
Yes, it sounds very practical. It sounds almost quite modern. Yeah,
I guess we should always be wary of making the mistake that the people who preceded us were different from us in any way, because they weren't really. No. So they'd have the same sense or lack of sense in organizing their societies that we do. So and it's just because we can look back and think that a lot of it is quaint or plain stupid. But when taken in the context of the time and with the information they had access to, they did the best they could with the information they had. And of course, a lot of that is extremely similar to contemporary conditions. And it's the same now when you see what the rules and regulations were in when epidemics were raging, which they did a lot.
Yes. I think we're beginning to understand a bit more clearly about how that must have felt.
Yes.
I think.
Yes. It's definitely, I suppose this is definitely training in empathy, all of this. Let's hope so, at any rate. Yeah. Yeah, because when in times of the plague, and there have been decades when the plague or some very contagious and deadly disease would be visited upon these lands, it would be these guys who would be in the forefront of all that. They would go and visit the houses of people where it was suspected someone had the plague. They would move these patients. They would nurse them in their convent, but also in quarantined places. Yes. For instance, on a small island in the middle of the river that no longer exists.
Oh, wow.
Or in a place outside the Hell Gate.
Okay.
And that was not the building that is still called the Plague House, because that's a mill, but it would have been in that vicinity. Wow. And of course, it would regularly occur that the brothers would die along with their patients.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, but they were also responsible for the burials.
So, how long approximately was the chapel and the men there? How long were they caring medically for the community?
Well, all of this has gone on with different institutional arrangements as well, because at some point these brothers were forced by especially the church authorities to incorporate themselves as an actual monastic order.
Yeah.
So they have been monastics for most of the centuries that they existed. But of course the big chasm in European culture is of course the French Revolution. When the revolutionary armies from France came to these parts, as in France, everything and anything religious was abolished. So the Cell brothers left the city, never to return. And that has not been the case everywhere where the order was abolished. There are still monks of this particular order working in several European countries, but also in countries where Europe has sent missionaries to. And there they will usually be known under the name of the Alexians.
Okay.
And the Alexians are still working in tending to the sick and the insane.
Wow. So, even today?
Yes. But not in Maastricht.
No.
Not in
Maastricht. So what happened in Maastricht once the order was abolished?
Well, the chapel and the convent were sort of, left to their own devices for quite some time. So they were standing empty. And of course the brothers had seen the abolition coming and had taken anything and everything of value out of the buildings. And I suppose that process was not stopped when they left. So you can just imagine that the building would get increasingly decrepit over time.
Yes.
But early in the 19th century, it was put to use again as the Municipal Pawnbroker. Of course, for hundreds and hundreds of years, pawnbrokers had been civilians. Usually, this entire idea originated in the north of Italy, the region we now all know by name, Lombardy. And from the name of that region, the Dutch language derives the name for a pawnbroker. We call them the Lommerd. And that Dutch word derives from the Italian name for that region. So they were often Italians, but they were also often Jews during the Middle Ages. But of course, these were private businesses, and at a certain moment, the authorities were so disgusted with the rates they were charging that it was made a public service, and that was housed in the chapel and the convent that was still standing at the time. And that has been in use for about a century, so well into the 20th century, when the new social laws sort of made a floor in the levels of poverty, and the services of a pawnbroker were not so in demand anymore. You have to realize this particular public pawnbroker worked especially for the poor people. So they had set a limit of the value of things that could be pawned. So poor people would bring their meager belongings and get a small amount of money for which they could then purchase something that they were in greater need of. And then if there was a little money again, they could come and get their belongings back. So and this was thousands and thousands of transactions every year. So there was a great demand for this service, which gives you an idea of the level of destitution that lots of people must have lived in.
Yeah. Are there records of those transactions?
That is why we know. Yes, that the archive, of course, has these extremely extensive and extremely minute records. It was all written down, every transaction. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. I imagine you can learn so much just from looking at the kind of things that people had to put up for the pawnbroker.
Yeah.
And so after its pawn days, what became of the chapel?
Yeah, it sort of hung on for dear life for another few decades. They put a floor in it halfway up, and the top floor was used first by the pawnbrokers, but later by a painter. And at a certain moment, they had to decide to tear down the convent because it had become too decrepit. And then after the Second World War, there was one of the historians, researchers in town who said, well, come on, if we don't take this in hand now, we will lose it. Let's restore this thing.
Yes.
And a big part in this was played as well by the famous brothers of the Bayard, the large brothers convent that had been established practically right next door during the 19th century. And those were the brothers who educated the common people of Maastricht. Well, the boys, of course. Yeah.
And that's where there's a model of Maastricht just outside the old convent. Yes. If you come on our Tiny Towns tour, you can discover the model. It's again, it's very hidden. I don't think I had ever even glanced at before I went on the tour. But it's very cool.
It is two steps away from the Brussels Street. I mean, really, all you have to do is walk through the gate to the Bayard, and then 10 steps in, you can't go any further because there's a large a gate, and it's guarded, and they won't let you in unless you've got some business at the Bayard. But between the gate at the street and the guarded gate, there is a small lodge, formerly the porter's lodge, and that's where this scale model is. And this was also conceived and built by brothers of the Bayard. Yeah, so there was quite a bit of interest in that congregation for cultural history of the city. I mean, quite a few of they were an order educating people, and one of the brothers there was also a teacher in the professional training I have had as a historian, and they had a magnificent library in the convent as well. So it's not really surprising that they wanted to save the chapel. After they'd already lost the small convent, they thought, well, the chapel is such a glorious little gem of Gothic architecture. Let's please restore that, and that happened. That was taken very good care of. Of course, some slip-ups here and there, and some mishaps here and there, but in its present shape, the place is safe. And its cultural heritage is safe. The paintings and the stones and the roof and everything. And it's in use. That is the thing that really makes me happy. The fact that we can still share experiences in places like that. Yeah.
Well, I think coming to Maastricht, that has been one of the wonderful things I have noticed, that there are so many old buildings, coming from an Australian, which are still being used as people's houses, as businesses, as just an array of things filling these lovely old buildings. And I think that's just as important as just having them on display or locking them up and throwing away the key. I think it's wonderful that they're filled with new people doing new things.
Yeah, I agree.
And the chapel as well is with weddings and parties, and it's lovely that can continue to be a part of Maastricht's life.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. Yeah.
So if people want to visit the chapel, you said it is open to the public. Is it open on a regular day?
No, that is the point. Of course, it is. It's not only in a secluded spot, but it is also only open for the events taking place there.
Yes.
So no, you can't just waltz in. That would be nice, but
no.
that is just not the case. They have a website, of course.
If you would like to visit the website to have a better look at what's going on and keep updated with the Cellebroederskapel, you can go to Cellebroederskapel.com. So have a Google, you'll find it. I did with my very terrible Dutch. We'll also try and put a link in our show notes and our description as well.
Good.
Yes. I had one question actually, Lucy. I read somewhere that at one point it was a brewery.
I have not
accurate?
seen any mention of that. No. In the sense that it would have been a business type of brewery. But generally, convents would have had facilities to bake their own bread and to brew their own beer. I have a picture here of when the convent was still standing, and this picture is of about 1925. And then, yes, the brewery did have, the convent did have its own brewery. But like I said, no, it was not the type of brewery like, the big abbeys in the countryside who will be exporting their beer all over Christendom.
No.
That's not the case. That would have been the case all over the city in all of these institutions. Because you could generally just not drink the water. It was not safe. So lots of places and lots of families as well, people in their own homes would brew a very low alcohol content beer for daily use, and people would drink beer instead of water. But yes, they did brew their own beer, but that was not anything extraordinary.
Yes, although it's quite hard to imagine going into a church nowadays and being offered
offhand, I also can't think
beer.
of any churches where they'd offer you beer. It's not the drink of choice in the ceremonies generally.
No. So for this podcast, we thought we would use our lovely Lucy to ask a local something that you've always wanted
dear.
to know about Maastricht. I'm sure there's lots of burning questions. And we asked you on social media if you did have any questions for Lucy. The first one is from Justina on Instagram. And she asks, do you know of any romantic stories related to the historic locations of Maastricht? Very old or more recent ones?
Oh dear. Well, obviously there must be hundreds. And I only know a few. So if any of you out there know of more stories, please send them in. I do not have an encyclopedia in my head. I have two stories. It is just I am not very sure if they should qualify as romantic. But here we go. The first one is of a lady who is called Maria Yacouba de Turin. And it plays itself out the second half of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century.
Okay.
She was not from Maastricht. She was from The Hague, but she was in love with a guy from Maastricht, and his name was Jacob Niepels. And they had an extremely tortuous relationship, which can be traced through lots of archival documents, because this relationship entailed a lot of violence and a lot of what we could consider now pretty pathological behavior on her part as well. Her Jacob was a soldier in the Dutch army, so she dressed herself up as a soldier as well to join his regiment.
Oh my goodness!
And she kept being found out and sent home, and she did this 5 times.
Oh wow!
Yeah, like I said, we would not consider that healthy behavior these days, but so romantic.
No, he must have been a very special man.
Well, I will not go into that
Okay.
at all. And when it came to the year 1689, they were reciprocally prosecuting each other, so drawing each other through the courts.
Okay.
Because she insisted he had promised to marry her. At any rate, he had made her pregnant.
Ooh.
Yeah. I guess the judges sort of were a bit out of sorts about all of this as well. And he was prosecuting her because she was stalking him. You know, of course, they didn't have this idea of stalking, which we have now, but that is essentially what he was complaining about.
Yes.
All of this ended in their marriage.
Okay. Took a turn.
Yeah. It took quite some time, yes, and all this all this nonsense, and keeping both military and judicial authorities in half the country occupied. So yeah. Anyway, that is one story that maybe could be classified as under the heading of romance.
Yeah, it depends what you think of romantic.
Yeah. Yeah, when you look at the style, at the defining characteristics of what romanticism is, of course there is definitely a place there for great emotions, you know, of whatever
Yes,
kind.
of course.
Anyway, the second story plays itself out in the second half of the 18th and the first half of the 19th century, and this concerns a Maastricht lady, born and raised here, and her name was Henriette d'Outremont de Vigimont. So, of course, this is nobility, as you can tell by the name. Our Henriette went to the court of the first Dutch king in The Hague, and she was there since 1817. Of course, the Netherlands have only had a king since 1815, when one of the Oranges decided to call himself king, and now we're sort of stuck with them. This king was, in our history, is designated as William I, who lived from 1772 until 1843, and he was married with a lady called Wilhelmina van Pruisen of appropriate high nobility, but he fathered children with her lady-in-waiting. Not Henriette, another lady-in-waiting.
Okay.
Yeah, and when his wife died, he asked not the mother of his children, but Henriette to marry him. And Henriette sort of fled the court, this feeling really confused and upset about all of this, because she felt that if he was going to marry again after the death of his wife, he should marry the mother of all his children and not her. Yeah, and this entire affair got even more sordid and upsetting, because it was sort of dragged through the mud by the yellow press of the time, so the Fox News of 19th century the Netherlands, but also large factions of segments of society opposed to the king.
Yeah.
So they were making up all sorts of horrible stories, and they were really defiling Henriette's reputation, primarily because of the fact that, of course, she was of Catholic stock, and to the Protestant in Holland, that was unacceptable.
Yes.
So it became a very politically motivated smear campaign, but eventually that did die down, and they were married in 1840, and he died in 1843.
Oh goodness.
Yeah.
After all that.
Yeah, after all that, but yeah, okay. So again, it is, not a romantic story in the sense of flowers and butterflies, and,
romantic in passion and
drama,
which is what we like in our romantic stories.
Yes, well, let's stick to that idea. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay. After all that drama and passion, we also received a question from Marjorie, which was pretty matter of fact. She inquired about Roman remains in Hague.
Yes.
There Might be a few, but we don't know. There have been excavations under the present-day St. Martin's Church in Wiek, and Titus Panhuizen, who was the archaeologist for the city at the time, he did find Roman remains there and published his research as well. And these remains seem to indicate, I'm phrasing this very carefully on purpose, they seem to indicate a settlement, but there is no proof so far. We'll just have to dig up more of Wiek to know.
I'm not sure that people will approve of you just digging up Wiek, Lucy.
Exactly. Yeah. But anybody, redecorating the cellar, please call the archaeologists first.
Yeah. Call them in for a dig. You never know what you'll find.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so much for the questions. But we're quite curious about what other things might be on your mind, and we'd like to hear about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Make sure you send us a message or an email or a pigeon carrying a small note.
Good.
And and we will do our very best to get back to you with some answers. Please be kind, so Lucy doesn't have to spend hours and hours researching, but we are very happy to make a valiant attempt. So thank you everyone for listening to our very first podcast. Please feel free to let us know what you think, and we are very open to any suggestions you might have. Don't forget to contact us if you have any questions. And what can we expect for our next recording, Lucy?
I will be talking about the Capucijnenhof, or the Capucins Court. I hope none of you know where that is, because it'll be a nice little discovery next time.
I think that should be our tagline. Just, I hope none of you know where that is. Thank you so much for joining us today, and don't forget to follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook by searching Meet Maastricht, and on Instagram at @meet_Maastricht. If you would like to learn more about us, you can also visit our website at meetmaastricht.eu, where you can buy tickets and subscribe to our monthly newsletter, so you're always up to date. Thanks again, and tune in next time to learn more about our beautiful city.
Tot ziens.